Giovanna is a professor of history and theory of art at Ecole Nationale Supérieure d'Art in Bourges, and associated researcher at Ecole des Hautes-Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Her PhD dissertation, published with the title The Artist is a Woman, The Modernity of Marcel Duchamp, was published in 2012 and was awarded the City of Paris Prize for Gender Studies. Giovanna was the Rudolf Arnheim Guest Professor of the Humboldt University in Berlin and Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Nantes. And in 2013-2014, she was in Rome at the French Academy, where she was working on the monograph on Carla Lonzi that is coming out next year. You can read Giovanna's work in English as well. She has published on art history, feminist review in the Oxford Art Journal. Together with Alexandra Gribaldo, she's the author of Lo schermo del potere, The Screen of Power, Feminism and the Regime of Visibility, that was published in 2012. And she's the editor of the French translation of Carla Lonzi's Autoritratto, which came out with JRP Ringier in 2012. And Giovanna is currently co-editing the volume Feminism and Art in Post-War Italy, The Legacy of Carla Lonzi, that Helena mentioned earlier. Giovanna, please.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this introduction. I would like to thank Helena, Rekip, Diana, Georgo, all the team who organized this event, which is really, I'm really excited to be part of. Is that okay with the mic? Yeah. And as you see, my presentation today will basically address Carla Lonzi's writing, especially her last book, Now You Can Go, but I think it will also resonate with some of the issues that have been addressed both by Fulvia and by Marina Wishmit, these issues of art, life, labor, but also how can we think of feminist subjectivity, and of course the question of withdrawal. So maybe we can have the first. So my paper today looks at Carla Lonzi's withdrawal from art and considers her feminist critique of art as labor. What does it mean to speak about life, labor, and art in a time where every human activity tends to be captured by the mechanism of production and consumption? How can we rethink the relation between these terms in a way that is able to resist this capture? So a short introduction about Carla Lonzi for the ones who, maybe there is still someone who is not so familiar with her work here. Carla Lonzi was an Italian writer, a feminist, an art critic, and a poet. And yet it is difficult to define her activities within these categories. Her persistent search for autonomous forms of expression inevitably resist any attempt to systematically categorize her production. Lonzi strived to undo the roles that she linked to her oppression, while constantly trying to articulate her subjective experience within a collective endeavor. And here I quote her from a text of 1978, where she writes, and I quote, "The consciousness of myself as a political subject is born out of the group, from the realization that has taken the shape of a non-ideological collective experience," end quote. So the separatist group is the site of the collective constitution of the subject, which is itself a collective working process. Her early feminist interventions of 1970, such as Let's Spit on Hegel, that was the first edition, called for a cultural revolution based on the woman's becoming a political subject. The next slide, please. In 1969, Carla Lonzi had published Autoritratto, Self-Portrait, a book based on the principle of montage, consisting of a series of conversations tape-recorded with 14 artists between 1965 and 1969. The book is a sharp critique of art criticism, institutional power, and became a farewell to the art world and to the activities she had carried on for over a decade. Lonzi was looking for a way to escape the inauthentic profession, as she says, of art criticism in favor of a participatory process that could be personally transformative. In 1970, together with Carla Cardi, who is the only woman artist taking part in the conversation of Autoritratto, Lonzi founded Rivolta Femminile, one of the first feminist collectives in Italy. Was based on separatism and autocoscienza, which translates self-consciousness, but also it's the Italian version of consciousness raising. Although during her life, Lonzi never became a public figure and had no direct connection with the mass feminist movement that took to the street during the 1970s, her writings have been retrospectively associated with the birth of a feminist consciousness. And she quickly became the most prominent feminist thinker of her generation in Italy. Next slide. For Lonzi, there was no possible reconciliation between her activity as an art critic and her engagement as a feminist, a fact that has contributed in the representation of her trajectory as dramatically bifurcated. However, despite this rupture in her biography, Lonzi continued to reflect upon art and its patriarchal structures from the separatist space of feminism. When she abandoned art criticism in 1970, Lonzi decided that she no longer wanted to be identified with an activity or a role in which she felt alienated. Her withdrawal did not concern just the art world. It signaled the beginning of a process of disidentification from the roles that organize and hierarchize life. In addressing Lonzi's position, I want to underline their resonances with Anglo-American feminist critiques of art as a patriarchal structure. Lonzi's ideas about the artist's masculinity and the function of art as ideology can be productively addressed within the broader critique of art that has been at the center of much of feminist art history and criticism. Feminist historians of her generation, such as Carol Duncan or Linda Nochlin, for example, have pointed the material conditions that have excluded women from artistic production, indicating in the sexual division of artistic labor a crucial aspect of art's ideological apparatus. However, what differentiates Lonzi's position is the fact that her critique is not purely theoretical, so to speak. On the contrary, it is always the result of a mediation with her own experience. Also, despite the fact that Lonzi was not involved with Marxist feminist groups in Italy, nor with the workerist debates in the 60s and 70s, Marxist feminist groups such as Lotta Femminista, of course, I also want to propose to discuss her ideas in the wider framework of a critique of the labor of love, as Silvia Federici would put it, and the refusal of work. This aspect is crucial in my understanding of her positioning against art as the basis upon which Lonzi imagines and embodies a new feminist subjectivity. Maybe we can, that's right. So this is what emerges from her last book, published in 1980, comprising the transcription of a tape-recorded conversation that lasted 4 days and terminated her lifelong relationship with the Italian artist Pietro Gonzaga. Vai pure, now you can go, which gives the title to this event, a dialogue with Pietro Gonzaga, records the crisis in a relationship where issues of art, labor, and love are intertwined. This conversation analyzes the crisis in a love relationship. The outcome of the dialogue is the demonstration that what happens in the personal sphere has a political meaning. As Lonzi states in the short introduction to the book intends to break the secrecy surrounding the heterosexual couple. The decision to disseminate this conversation thus becomes a sort of unmasking. During the dialogue, Lonzi returns to the meaning of her withdrawal from art and underlines her precarious situation in comparison to Gonzaga's privileged position as a successfully established artist. And here I quote Lonzi, who says at some point, well, I just want you to realize this condition of ours, of you as a cultural figure and of myself living at the mercy of a world without control, which is the private, end quote. While her activity accords with her life, thus remaining unnoticed, Consagra's circumstances are entirely registered by the mechanism of social and cultural recognition. For Lonzi, these mechanisms are consistent with patriarchal structures such as individualism, competition between men, etc., from which women are excluded. So the discussion revolves around Consagra's identification as an artist and how this determines every single aspect of his life, as opposed to Lonzi's search for a strategy of disidentification from the roles that organize human activity. According to Lonzi, an artist's life is regulated by his creative labor in a way that blurs the distinction between the two. One is an artist 24 hours a day, she says to Consagra. The artist thus embodies the paradigm of the individual whose life, his relations, affects, time, and sexuality are entirely at the service of the affirmation of his creative personality. And maybe next slide. Okay, no, next one, sorry. During the 1960s, while she was working at the book Autoritratto, Lonzi had endorsed the artist's autonomy and freedom in opposition to the institutional role of the critic. In line with modernist ideas about art's autonomy, she had considered the artist as exemplary of a life beyond labor, considered as a social relation. At the time, Lonzi believed that art was not a socially constructed activity, neither a role. On the contrary, she argued for art as the only possibility to escape the alienating forces organizing social life. For that reason, for her, the artist had nothing to do with the worker. An artist is not a worker, according to Lonzi in the 1960s. His or her freedom prevents him or her to be identified with a category or a group of workers. This is the meaning, I believe, of Lonzi's notion of the artist's authenticity, a crucial term in her understanding of the artist's autonomy, a term that is also reminiscent of her interest in French philosophy and theory and the immense influence of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre for her generation. I'm not going into that. So the artist's authenticity becomes a term to define the artist's autonomy as opposed to the critic's coercive and institutional function. However, after 10 years of feminism, Lonzi's position had dramatically shifted. By 1980, the artist has become first and foremost an alienated worker. The mythical structure sustaining the artist's male privilege is now based on his identification with his work. The artist's autonomy has turned into ideology, while the critic is no longer associated with a repressive and an authoritative function, but has become a feminized figure and the victim of the artist's imposture. Lonzi's feminism is in many ways based on her changing ideas about the artist and the critic. So to go back once again to Autoritratto, in the book, Lonzi's relations with the artist became the ground upon which she had accomplished the process of undoing her own role as an art critic. However, this also became a source of disappointment, as the artists themselves were not ready to do the same. Their dependence from the cultural structures defining creativity resulted in the refusal to challenge the way an artist's life and relations are bound to prestige and recognition. In the early 1970s, Lonzi became aware of this divide. The artist, she writes in her diary, is too much loaded with myth, end quote. The dialogue with Pietro Consagra is reminiscent of this past delusion. Here, Lonzi clarifies that the artist's autonomy can only exist at the expense of the woman's freedom, since it needs to dismiss the relational dimension of life and repress it in the private sphere. Accordingly, an artist's existence is predicated on what now appears as the myth of his autonomy. In analyzing the conflict between art and life, Lonzi opposes the male artist as the unique protagonist to the woman's desire to be recognized as an autonomous subject. The conversation also clarifies the role of woman's subordination for the artist's myth of autonomy. On one side, there is the woman who is aware of the fact that nobody will listen to what she has to say. On the other, the artist, who refuses to question the distinction connected to his social identity. What Consagra considers as his own needs is in fact the male privilege against which Lonzi is struggling. The book opens up with an impasse between Consagra's identification as an artist and Lonzi's refusal to fulfill the accompanying tasks required by the creative personality. Consagra openly states that the artist's privilege implies asymmetrical relations in which women occupy a subordinate role, and he really uses this word. He says at some point that artists need to have subordinates. So it's very explicit. This role can be identified with the affective labor and complicity traditionally performed by the artist's wife or lover. As Consagra explains, he wants to be with a woman who is there to sustain him in his career, which Lonzi refuses to do. And just to have the quote, a longer quote from Pietro Consagra speaking, who says, "With you, I led the most interesting life I ever had experienced from an emotional, intellectual, and complete point of view. But I needed someone by my side during my social life as well, in my work, in my worries. It was there that I missed you. I couldn't stand being alone while I was with the woman who didn't help me at times when I desperately needed help. Company and encouragement when I felt lonely, or when I was traveling for my exhibitions or in my studio." End quote. Carla Lonzi proposes instead a radical alternative of a non-instrumental relationship, where being together can become something like a means without an end, as Claire Fontaine has observed. Lonzi says, "For me this is inconceivable. I don't know where this way of feeling is taking me, but I cannot overturn the priorities between our needs, because what I want is love for my autonomy, which is not love of my dependence and of my service." End quote. Against the patriarchal organization and seizure of life, Lonzi counters her desire for a society based on a collective and participatory being together, freed from the conditioning of social recognition. Lonzi indicates a possibility of living otherwise, of a life capable to resist the mechanism of valorization and capture typical of the artist's life. And here I have a longer quote from Lonzi, always vai pure, who says, "My social dimension is the group. I see my life as a group that you are part of, like any other persons with whom I have a dialogue, who are limited only by the possibility that I might be interested in such dialogues. And this absorbs my life. It gives me some thought, and it constantly nourishes me. It keeps me awake, and I have no need for symbolic relations. It doesn't even come to my mind. I can't feel the fatigue of this work, even though it is stressful, but it is also congenial, like breathing. Maybe breathing is fatiguing too. It certainly is. They say that when someone dies, the moment when you cease to breathe is a great relief. But life is breathing. For me, to live means to have real relations. It's not something else." End quote. Well, before Carla Lonzi, Marcel Duchamp had declared that breathing was preferable than working. thereby introducing the idea that art could be simply a matter of living. Duchamp constantly refused the roles, functions, identities, categories that organize human subjectivity and activity, art included. Indeed, as Maurizio Lazzarato has shown, Duchamp rejected the injunction to assume a pre-established role or identity designed to organize social relations. For him, art as a social institution constituted a technique of governing subjectivity that needed to be cast aside. The meaning of Duchamp's refusal of work has thus to be understood in the framework of his strategy of disidentification. However, his refusal of work was in no way part of a shared transformative practice. Likewise, by rejecting an overtly antagonistic position, he was working above all to redefine the role of art and the artist. In contrast, the politics of disidentification and the refusal of work advocated by Carla Lonzi is part of an effort towards a collective revolt and becoming. In Lonzi's view, feminine revolt can only start with the process of undoing the roles that govern women's existence. To engage with this desire for transformation, one must break the circle of the repetition of roles, of stereotypes, of all the cliches that construct and identify women. Refusing to occupy the role of woman opens up the possibility to be something else, to imagine a different becoming, which is no longer based on repetition and oppression. The figure of the clitoral woman, which Lonzi envisions in the early 70s, suggests precisely the revolt against woman as an already available product, which is the vaginal woman in Lonzi's vocabulary. You know, she wrote this text, The Clitoral Woman and the Vaginal Woman, in 1971. The affirmation of an autonomous sexuality thus becomes the sign of a new subjectivity that does not correspond with woman as it was known before. Lonzi's conversation with Consagra is an attempt to change the relations that perpetuate the roles oppressing women's lives. Against the patriarchal organization of life, Lonzi counters her desire for a society based on a collective, relational, and participatory being together, freed from the conditioning of social recognition. Sorry, this I repeated. Indeed, in Vai Pure, Lonzi develops some of the issues already posed in the first manifesto of Rivolta Femminile, written in 1970. Here we can find several passages where the critique of reproductive labor goes hand in hand with the refusal of work as the only possible form of life. And I have a longer quote from the manifesto. And this is the original manifesto, which was hung on the walls in Rome and in Milan in the summer of 1970. So I quote some extracts here. We identify in unpaid domestic work the help that allows both private and state capitalism to survive. We detest the mechanism of competitiveness and the blackmail exercised in the work by the hegemony of efficiency. We want to put our working capacity at the disposal of a society that is immune to this. Attributing value to unproductive moments is an extension of life proposed by woman. End quote. These paragraphs resonate with the Wages Against Housework campaign of the mid-1970s. According to Silvia Federici, wages for housework are the first step of the struggle against woman's social role and thus against work itself. The demand for wages makes visible woman's hidden and socially unrecognized work, which is the condition to start struggling against it. In denying housework the status of labor, capital has transformed it into an act of love and has identified women with the reproductive task they have to accomplish. Federici challenges woman's assimilation with housework and the very notion that love can be nothing else than labor. In a similar way, Lonzi's desire to be loved for her autonomy instead of her service offers a radical alternative to the idea that love is just a function of the patriarchal organization of labor, capitalist organization of labor. Lonzi also counters, like Federici, the idea of woman's work as unproductive, although she's not interested in broadening the concept of class, unlike Federici. Rather, she attempts to overturn woman's association with unproductivity and transform it into a political program. And I think this is really the meaning of the word rivolta as the name of the group, where rivolta means both to revolt, to struggle against, but also to overturn, to turn upside down the meaning of things. In Lonzi's dialogue with Pietra Consagra, the manifesto's call for a rejection of capitalist competitive structures, including efficiency and labor, in favor of free sexuality and non-productivity, are translated in the everyday struggle of a woman seeking to escape the way these structures permeate the most intimate sphere of her life. The book Vai Pure is a striking document about the political intensity of the conflicts that are played out in the private sphere. Lonzi's awareness of the separation between artwork and personal, private relations upon which social life is organized becomes the privileged ground for her struggle for recognition and transformation. So to conclude, and maybe also to go back to my initial question, is it possible to envision a life beyond work? Lonzi's positioning against art translates a broader critique of the seizure of life and its reduction to work. Her political and existential project is certainly deemed to remain utopian. However, I believe her endeavor to live a life that is neither a commodity nor a possession, but is rather made of relations and shared experiences, can still be relevant today as the barriers between the private and the productive spheres tend to dissolve. Thank you.